There's something haunting about silence in the jungle, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your ears like a warning. Something moves. You hear it, but you don't see it. And in the thick humidity of the Philippine forest, silence can be more terrifying than gunfire. For Hiroo Onoda, that silence wasn't peace. It wasn't the end of war. It was a trap, a lie, and he was trained to resist it. In December of 1944, the Empire of Japan was nearing the edge of collapse. The Pacific had turned. The Allies were reclaiming territory island by island. The sky belonged to the Americans, and the once feared Japanese Navy was being ground into rust beneath the waves. But on the island of Lubang, a small, mostly forgotten speck west of Manila, one man stepped off a boat with orders that would define his life in a way no one could have predicted. Not even him. Hiroo Onoda was 22 years old, sharp-eyed, trained in intelligence and guerrilla tactics, and utterly loyal. Japan, in its desperation, had changed its strategy. No longer was it about victory through strength. Now it was about delay, damage, disruption. His mission was simple but absolute. Destroy enemy infrastructure. Don't die unnecessarily. Don't surrender. Ever. Hold out until reinforcements arrive, even if it takes years. That phrase, that even if it takes years, will become a kind of curse. He wasn't alone when he arrived. He was part of a group. Others had been stationed before him, and others would die before him. But from the beginning, there was a kind of purity to his mindset. He didn't question the command. He didn't ask how long was too long. The war to him was not just bullets and banners. It was identity, purpose. Without war, what was he? The first few months were textbook. Reconnaissance, sabotage, blending into the dense green. But the island was no fortress. It was a place where the war would eventually collapse inward. When the American and Filipino forces landed in early 1945, the island fell swiftly. The command structure that had once given Onoda direction vanished like smoke in the wind. His officers died. Others fled or surrendered. But he stayed. He was certain this wasn't over. His country couldn't lose. And if someone told him otherwise, they were the enemy. As the gunfire faded and peace officially returned to the world, Onoda dug in deeper. News came. Leaflets, loudspeakers, messages from planes overhead, all declaring the war had ended. Japan had surrendered. He read them. He analyzed them. And he dismissed them. He thought it was a trick. It made sense to him. Propaganda was common. Psychological warfare was real. The Allies wanted him to drop his guard, to expose his position, and so he refused. Not once, not for a second did he believe Japan could lose. The nation he had pledged his life to, it was unthinkable that it would give up. If they hadn't won, they were regrouping. They would return. They would need him, and he would be ready. Years passed, not months, years. The jungle became his home. The vines his camouflage. He hunted for food, stole rice, shot at passing farmers he believed were enemies. He moved like a ghost, a shadow on an island that no longer remembered there was still a war going on. He believed he was surrounded by collaborators and invaders. His commitment wasn't just survival, it was faith. And faith, when unchallenged, becomes something else entirely. People tried to reach him. Not once, not twice. Dozens of attempts were made. But every time someone approached, he saw a trap. When former comrades were flown in to plead with him through megaphones, he thought they were being coerced. When letters from family came, he believed them forged. The line between real and imagined dissolved in the echo chamber of the jungle. His war had stopped being about Japan. It had become personal. A cause divorced from time. A war of one. By 1950, 5 years after the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Onoda was still in the jungle, still watching, still shooting, still hiding. He had no idea that Japan had rebuilt itself, that cities had risen from ashes, that school children were learning English, that American soldiers now walked Tokyo not as conquerors, but as protectors in a new alliance. None of that existed in his world. In his world, the emperor still needed him. In his world, surrender meant shame. Death would be better. but only if it were useful. Even as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and a new generation came of age under neon lights and modern skyscrapers, he remained frozen in time, like a statue buried beneath vines, moving only to strike. He was now not just a soldier, he was a relic, but relics are sacred things in some cultures. And when Japan finally began to reckon with his story, it wasn't with shame or scorn. It was with awe and sorrow. In Japan, people began to speak his name with a mix of reverence and disbelief. Could it really be? Could one man have fought for so long, so absolutely, that reality itself no longer reached him? And if so, what did that say about the power of belief? Of duty? That's the real beginning of Hiroo Onoda's legend. Not the moment he was deployed. Not even the moment he refused to surrender. But the moment the world began to realize this wasn't just a war story. It was a mirror showing us what it means to believe in something so deeply that even truth, even time, can't shake it. As the rest of the world moved on, Hiroo Onoda went further inward. The war that had started with roaring engines and bomb blasts had long since gone quiet. But inside his mind, it was louder than ever. Each sunrise was another battle. Each sound in the underbrush a potential ambush. There was no calm, no exhale. Just a life stretched out on the edge of a blade, waiting for a signal that never came. At first, he wasn't alone. When the Japanese garrison on Lubang collapsed in 1945, a handful of stragglers scattered into the jungle with him. They were like a small tribe, bound not by family or friendship, but by a singular belief. They were still soldiers. Together, they moved in silence through the thick canopy, surviving on bananas, coconuts, and the occasional stolen chicken. They knew every twist of the terrain, every hollow log and hidden stream. They were ghosts, and they wanted it that way. But ghosts, too, can start to fade. Onoda wasn't the leader by rank, but his conviction made him the center. He enforced discipline, made the decisions, maintained structure, and as months turned to years, that structure held them in place. Even as their uniforms rotted, even as their rifles rusted, they remained an army, a forgotten, invisible army. Patrols, watch shifts, weapon maintenance. These weren't just habits. They were acts of defiance, evidence that they still mattered. But as the years passed, doubt crept in. One by one, the others began to question. Some believed the war had truly ended. They had seen too many leaflets, heard too many voices pleading from helicopters overhead. Onoda refused to accept any of it. To him, it wasn't just about truth. It was about betrayal. If the war had ended and Japan had surrendered, it meant all their sacrifices had been for nothing. That couldn't be allowed. So he doubled down. Every farmer who yelled that the war was over, every child who shouted at them from the village edge, they were liars, pawns, enemies. And Onoda was trained to resist. In 1949, one of his comrades surrendered, just walked out of the jungle one day and turned himself in. The man later said he simply wanted to go home. He missed food, family, normal life. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't broken. He just chose peace. Onoda took it as betrayal. The jungle was now shrinking, not in size, but in allegiance. He was down to 3. The following decade was a slow erosion of sanity. They still launched raids, stole supplies, burned rice fields. To them, it was warfare, but to the locals, it was madness. By now, most on the island knew who they were, knew the stories. They were no longer feared enemies. They were ghosts, dangerous, unpredictable, trapped in a past no one else shared. And the world? It was shifting at light speed. Japan entered its economic miracle in the 1950s. Factories turned rubble into steel. Cars rolled out onto new highways. Children wore Western clothes and listened to American jazz. The nation that Onoda believed would one day return for him was busy building bullet trains and television networks. There was no army coming. There never had been, but still he waited. In 1954, tragedy struck. One of Onoda's last companions, a man he had lived beside for nearly a decade, was killed in a skirmish with local authorities. Shot in a clash that never needed to happen. The death hit Onoda hard, but not the way it would hit most men. He didn't mourn. He didn't cry. He hardened. That death, to him, was evidence. Proof that the war still raged. Why else would the enemy keep coming? He and the last remaining comrade kept going. Two shadows, aging slowly in a world where time had lost meaning. But time, whether you believe in it or not, eventually catches up. By the late 1960s, he was nearly alone, and the man beside him was tired, not just physically, but spiritually. In 1972, after a brief gunfight with a search party, that last companion fell, shot and killed, leaving Onoda truly alone for the first time in nearly 30 years. It was the kind of loneliness that defies explanation, not just absence of people, but absence of belief. He had always had someone beside him to echo his convictions. Now, there was only silence. And still, he held on. He set up new camps, slept in trees, dug new trenches. He scouted the shorelines to look for the imaginary invading fleets that would one day arrive. Every radio report, every dropped newspaper he found near villages, carefully studied, then discarded as misinformation. It was all part of the game. He had been trained for this. He would win. And back in Japan, the myth of him grew. News had spread over the years. Occasionally, stories would appear, soldiers still holding out in the Philippines. Some laughed. Others felt sorrow. But beneath it all, there was something else. A strange kind of national grief. Because while the country had moved on, embraced peace, embraced technology, embraced a new role in the world, there was still one man out there fighting the old war. Their war. A mirror they didn't want to look into too long. He wasn't just lost. He was forgotten by time. Left behind by a country that had no use for heroes anymore. By the 1970s, Hiroo Onoda had been living in the jungle longer than he had lived anywhere else in his life. 28 years had passed since the end of the Second World War. In that time, a man had walked on the moon. The Cold War had reshaped global politics. Empires had risen and fallen again. The world was on its second war in Vietnam. Generations had come and gone. But on a small Philippine island, one man still clung to a conflict that no longer existed. At least, not for anyone else. But for Onoda, the world outside was illusion, and the jungle was real. And so the myth grew. In Tokyo, his name became a whisper again. People spoke of him with the kind of disbelief reserved for ghost stories. Not because they doubted his existence, but because they couldn't understand it. How could anyone remain in hiding, refusing to believe the war was over for nearly 3 decades? Many had tried to reach him. The Japanese government had made attempts in the 50s and 60s. Loudspeakers had been used. Leaflets dropped. Even relatives had flown to the Philippines to beg him to come out. But Onoda remained unconvinced. Each attempt confirmed what he already believed. They were enemy tactics, tricks. You don't stop fighting because someone says the war is over. You stop when your commanding officer tells you to. And that, more than anything, was the key. Onoda wasn't waiting for peace. He wasn't waiting for comfort or rescue. He was waiting for a command. For someone in uniform, someone with real authority to look him in the eye and say, "You can stand down now." Until then, everything was a lie. Every smiling face, every dropped message, every newspaper headline. Back in Japan, a new generation had come of age who had never known war. Among them was a young man named Norio Suzuki, idealistic, curious, and obsessed with the extraordinary. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a government official. He was a wanderer, a student of the human condition, and he had a wild idea. In 1974, Suzuki left Japan on a mission he called his search for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. The world laughed. But Suzuki wasn't joking. He believed Onoda was out there. More than that, he believed he could reach him, not with force, not with loudspeakers, but with humanity. And so he trekked to Lubang. No backup, no weapons, just instinct and persistence. It took 4 days of searching, sleeping in abandoned huts and moving carefully through the overgrowth before he found a man in tattered fatigues, rifle in hand, staring at him from the shadows of the trees. It was Onoda. Imagine the moment. Two strangers, one from a nation that had forgotten war, the other still living inside it, a gap of 3 decades between them. But Suzuki didn't raise his hands in surrender. He didn't shout or plead. He simply bowed calmly and said the words Onoda had not heard in so long. "I am Japanese. I know who you are." What followed was not instant peace. Onoda didn't lay down his weapon, but something shifted. The tone, the rhythm. Here was someone who didn't mock him, didn't lie to him, didn't speak like an enemy. Suzuki asked questions. He listened, and most importantly, he didn't try to convince Onoda that the war was over. He asked what Onoda needed to hear for himself. Onoda's response was simple. "I will not surrender until my superior officer comes and orders me to do so." That was the key. Not logic, not reason. Command, the chain of obedience forged in the heart of an empire that no longer existed. Suzuki returned to Japan with a message. Onoda is alive. He is healthy. He is armed. And he is still loyal. The government scrambled. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Onoda's former commanding officer, who had long since retired and was now a quiet bookseller in a Tokyo suburb. His name was Yoshimi Taniguchi. When approached, he didn't hesitate. He agreed to return to the Philippines, put on his old uniform, and meet the man who had never stopped serving him. On March 9th, 1974, a moment happened that defied belief. On a grassy clearing in the Lubang jungle, under the bright tropical sun, Hiroo Onoda stood at attention, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his uniform a patchwork of stitched cloth and jungle stains. And before him stood Taniguchi, in full dress, medals and all, holding a written order in his hand. The two men locked eyes. Neither flinched. Neither broke. Then the words came. "The war is over. You're ordered to lay down your arms." No emotion. No drama. Just clarity. And for the first time in 29 years, Onoda exhaled. He stepped forward, slowly, and removed his rifle. Then his bayonet. Then his dagger. His ammunition belt. One by one, he placed them on the ground. Not as surrender, but as a final act of service. It was over. The war he had fought alone for nearly 3 decades had ended. Not with a bang. Not with defeat. But with a voice of command he could finally believe. When he emerged from the jungle, the cameras were already waiting. Flashbulbs, reporters, military officials, curious locals. They all stared in awe as a man who had become a myth walked into the light. He bowed before the president of the Philippines and formally offered his sword. It was refused. He was pardoned because, as the president said, he had committed no crime. He had only followed orders. But as Onoda stood there, blinking into the sun, surrounded by cheers and applause, the truth was plain in his eyes. The world had changed, and he didn't know if he belonged in it. When Hiroo Onoda boarded the plane back to Japan in March 1974, the crowd at the airport watched in silence. Some stared in disbelief, others in sorrow, but no one really knew what to feel. This man stepping off the tarmac wasn't a returning veteran in the usual sense. He was a fragment of another era. An echo of a past Japan had tried to bury beneath skyscrapers and neon lights. He didn't come home to the Japan he remembered. That Japan was gone. In 1944, the land he had left was war-torn, desperate, clinging to an identity of strength and sacrifice. Now it was modern, rich, and unrecognizable. Cars zipped by in polished silence. Women wore miniskirts. Teenagers played electric guitars in underground bars. Buildings reached higher than any temple he'd ever seen. Western influence was everywhere, on the radio, on billboards, in the language itself. English words peppered everyday conversation. And for a man whose entire worldview had been frozen in time, this wasn't home. It was another foreign country. He arrived not to quiet, but to chaos. Hundreds gathered to see him. Cameras followed his every move. The media portrayed him as a hero, a relic, a loyal soldier of impossible devotion. Some wept, some saluted, others simply watched, unsure if they were witnessing a miracle or a tragedy. And Onoda, standing in his perfectly pressed suit, said very little. He wasn't ready for this. He'd spent nearly 30 years surviving on instinct, hiding from the world. He hadn't slept in a real bed since the Roosevelt administration. He hadn't spoken casually with another human being who didn't carry a rifle since he was in his 20s. Now, people asked for his autograph. They asked him to smile. They asked him how it felt. How it felt. How do you explain that the war you fought became a memory the world tried to forget? How do you talk about loss when no one else feels it anymore? How do you return to a place that moved on without you? His parents were older than he'd imagined. His brother a stranger. Friends gone, dead, or aged into versions of themselves he couldn't recognize. Even the language had changed. The rhythm, the slang, the pace of life was too fast, and yet it all felt empty. The discipline that had sustained him, the mission that had given him purpose, gone in a single sentence. He tried to adjust. He did interviews, gave speeches, wrote a memoir, but none of it filled the hole. He was praised for his loyalty, but it wasn't a celebration he wanted. He wasn't looking for glory. He was looking for meaning. In private, he admitted that he cried himself to sleep many nights after returning, not because he regretted surviving, but because he didn't know what survival was supposed to mean anymore. He had fought for a nation that no longer wanted fighters. He had endured for an emperor who no longer ruled. The code he had lived by, the Bushido code of obedience, honor, endurance, had no place in this new Japan. Worse still, he started to realize people saw him more as a curiosity than a man. He was turned into a symbol, a cautionary tale, a headline. People asked if he was crazy, if he'd really believed the war hadn't ended. They laughed about the leaflets, the messages he refused to believe. They didn't understand that it had never been about believing the war was still happening. It was about refusing to betray the idea that it ever could end that way. To him, surrender was not a fact. It was a choice. And it was a choice he refused to make, even alone, even starving, even after burying his comrades one by one. By 1975, the interviews had slowed, the novelty faded, people moved on again, and Onoda, surrounded by a world emotion, felt still, isolated in a country that no longer needed his kind of strength. So he left. He moved to Brazil. The jungles there weren't unlike Lubang. Wild, vast, quiet. He bought land, raised cattle, worked the soil. For a man who had survived off the land for decades, farming was the closest thing to peace he could manage. No cameras, no applause, just routine, simplicity, something real. In the years that followed, Japan continued to wrestle with his legacy. To some, he was a national hero. To others, a symbol of Japan's dangerous past, a remnant of blind obedience and wartime delusion. There were editorials, debates, university discussions. But to Onoda, those voices meant nothing. What mattered was that he had followed orders. He had stayed true to the mission. And the cost of that truth was a life lived in a world that no longer recognized him. Still, he kept himself busy. Occasionally, he returned to Japan to visit or to speak to young people. He would talk about discipline, about perseverance. But he always warned against blind allegiance. That was a lesson most people missed in his story. He hadn't wanted others to follow his path. He just didn't know how to leave it once it started. Because war doesn't end with a treaty. For some, it ends in pieces, in slow, bitter realizations, in decades of silence. And sometimes it doesn't end at all. In time, Hiroo Onoda's story moved from headlines to textbooks, from shock to reflection. The firestorm of media coverage that had greeted his return cooled, and what remained was something more enduring. Questions, not about logistics, not about how he had survived, but about why. Why did he hold on so long? What does it mean to be loyal to an idea long after the world has abandoned it? For Japan, these questions struck deep. The 1970s were a decade of economic ascent. Industry boomed. The scars of war had been replaced by steel towers and global trade deals. The country was increasingly modern, democratic, pacifist. But the memory of what had fueled its aggression in the 1930s and 40s, the nationalism, the emperor worship, the imperial myth, was still there, buried just beneath the surface. And Onoda embodied all of it. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a mirror to an era Japan had tried to forget. His story dragged uncomfortable truths back into the light. That the war had been fought on blind obedience. That millions had died not just because they had to, but because they were told to. That loyalty, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes a prison. But at the same time, people admired him. How could you not? He endured starvation, isolation, grief. He watched the world crumble and rebuild itself without him, and still, he held firm. There was something undeniably human about that kind of faith. Tragic, yes, but pure. In Japanese schools, teachers debated how to present his story. Was he a symbol of patriotism, or a warning against extremism? Was he a hero or a cautionary tale? Some saw him as the ultimate example of personal honor. Others, as a final victim of a brutal military culture that had brainwashed an entire generation. And it wasn't just Japan. Across the world, Onoda became a point of fascination. Military historians examined his tactics. Psychologists studied his mental resilience. Survivalists revered his skills. His name appeared in magazines, documentaries, novels. But no matter how many books were written or theories offered, no one could fully grasp what it felt like to live in a forest for 30 years with nothing but conviction to keep you warm. And there was another layer too, one less often discussed, but no less real, the damage done to the people of Lubang. For Onoda, they had been enemies. But for the farmers, the families, the children, he had been a phantom, a threat in the dark. He and his comrades had killed livestock, burned crops, even shot civilians they mistook for enemy collaborators. It wasn't out of malice. It was war in his mind. But for those villagers, it was terrorism. A man trapped in a conflict long ended, inflicting pain no one could understand. Years later, Onoda would express sorrow for that. Not exactly regret. He couldn't betray his duty. But sorrow, yes. He understood the pain he had caused. And in his visits to the Philippines in later life, he met with the families, looked them in the eyes, and said what words he could. It was never enough, but it mattered. As he aged, his public appearances grew rarer. He wrote occasionally, spoke to students, always careful, always guarded. But in his later writings, a shift emerged. He began to speak less about loyalty to country and more about loyalty to one's own values. He urged young people to think for themselves, to live with purpose, not obedience. He never disavowed his past, but he no longer glorified it. And that quiet evolution, that slow softening, may have been his final act of service. Because what Onoda's story offers isn't just a tale of endurance. It's a map of the dangers and virtues of belief. He showed us how deeply a human being can cling to purpose, how long the mind can hold on to meaning, but also how easily that meaning can become disconnected from truth. He died in 2014 at the age of 91. When the news broke, it was met not with frenzy but with stillness. Flags weren't lowered. Statues weren't built. But all across Japan and beyond, people paused to remember the man who had fought a war alone, for no one to see, for no applause, simply because he believed it was his duty. He left behind no children, no descendants. But he left behind something else, a legacy etched not in victory or defeat, but in the complex space between. Because Hiroo Onoda wasn't just the last man of World War II. He was proof that a war's end is not defined by treaties or dates. Sometimes it ends when the last person finally puts down the rifle. And sometimes, even then, it echoes. After his death in 2014, Hiroo Onoda's story didn't fade away. It multiplied. But something strange happened. It stopped being his story. In documentaries, articles, even films, his life began to morph. Writers reshaped it to fit their own messages. He became a metaphor, a plot device, an emblem. One moment he was the ultimate soldier, unbending, unbroken. The next, a symbol of delusion, of fanaticism. One culture saw honor, another saw tragedy. The truth, as it often does, sat somewhere in between. In Japan, Onoda was both admired and mourned, but carefully. No politician dared use a story too boldly. They knew the weight it carried. On one hand, He stood for values that the country had once built its entire wartime identity around: loyalty, endurance, sacrifice. But on the other hand, those same values have been weaponized to drag Japan into catastrophe. Onoda's return forced an uncomfortable truth back into focus, that those virtues, when untethered from reality, can lead not to glory but to ruin. So the government honored him, quietly, with restraint, as if unsure whether to celebrate or apologize. In other places, though, the story took on a life of its own. Writers in the West were fascinated by the psychological angle. The man who had been brainwashed by imperial propaganda, who clung to fiction in the face of fact. Articles ran with headlines like "The Man Who Couldn't Stop Fighting" or "Japan's Lost Soldier." But they often missed something critical. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was. They overlooked the clarity with which he moved, the purpose with which he lived. To call him deluded is to ignore the depth of his logic. He didn't stay because he couldn't accept peace. He stayed because peace had to come through proper channels. The world had rules, and those rules mattered more than circumstance. That was a tragedy. Not ignorance, but unwavering structure in a world that had shifted beneath him. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, his name evoked something different entirely. Pain. For the people of Lubang, he had not been a fable. He had been real. For decades, farmers lived in fear of venturing too deep into the woods. Children heard stories of the Japanese man with a gun. Families lost livestock, lost property. Some lost loved ones. Onoda's war, though unintended, had left scars on an island that had already bled during the Japanese occupation years before. When he returned decades later to formally apologize, many received him with grace. Some didn't, and who could blame them? The line between soldier and threat had blurred long ago. His explanation that he was only following orders was true, but it wasn't enough. It rarely is. Still, he made the visit, not because he had to, but because somewhere inside he understood. Whatever honor meant, it required facing the truth, even if it hurt. And then there were the books, the movies, the dramatizations. A 2021 film, Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, reignited interest in his life. Audiences watched, mesmerized by the surreal dedication of a man who had lived for decades in a war of his own making. But even that portrayal, though respectful, was still a lens, filtered through creative interpretation, condensed, dramatized. The real man, with his doubts, contradictions, dry sense of humor, and quiet sorrow, could never fully be captured on screen. Because the hardest thing to portray was that Onoda never thought himself as special. He didn't see his story as remarkable. He didn't consider himself a hero or a victim. To him, he had just done his duty. Nothing more. He hadn't looked for cameras. He hadn't wanted awards. When he re-entered society, he did so because the order finally came. That was the whole truth. Not romance. Not legend. Obedience. And yet, people projected everything onto him. Writers used him to question the nature of authority. Philosophers dissected his years as a case study in belief. Nationalists called him an icon. Pacifists called him a warning. In every narrative, someone tried to claim his life as proof of something, as if his 3 decades of silence were meant to support a message crafted years later. But that's the thing about stories that grow too big. They stop belonging to the people who live them. And Onoda, for all his fame, remained strangely untouched by it. In interviews, he answered questions with honesty but little flourish. He didn't embellish. He didn't sell. His life had already been spent. There was nothing more to perform. Even as history absorbed him into its myths, he stayed grounded in a truth very few ever grasped. That to survive, truly survive, isn't just about endurance. It's about identity. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tells you that you don't exist anymore. And that's why his story still resonates. Because every person, in some way, is fighting a war others can't see. We all hold on to beliefs that no longer fit. We all struggle to know when to let go. Onoda just did it longer, deeper, in a jungle where time stood still and meaning was carved not in words, but in days survived. For nearly 30 years, Hiroo Onoda held fast to a world no one else inhabited. But even in a life built on discipline, even in a mind shaped by military doctrine and hardened by survival, there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, ones that slipped in between the patrols and the strategy meetings and the rustling of leaves in the jungle at night. Moments of doubt. He rarely spoke of them in detail. Onoda was not a man who liked to dwell in hypotheticals. But if you read his writings closely, if you watched the way his eyes shifted in certain interviews, they were there. Questions that pressed against the back of his mind, like wind against a closed door. What if I was wrong? What if the war really had ended, and I just didn't believe it? He had found hundreds of leaflets. He had seen newspapers, even radios. They spoke of peace, of reconstruction, of surrender. For a rational man, and Onoda was rational, it wasn't that the evidence was lacking. It was that the evidence didn't match the framework he trusted. The facts weren't the problem. The source was. To believe them would have required undoing the core of who he was. And for a man whose identity had fused completely with his mission, that kind of undoing felt like death. But the jungle has a way of creeping in. Over time, the silence grows louder. You start noticing how long it's been since you last saw real combat. You start to wonder why the invasion never came. Why the reinforcements you were supposed to assist never arrived. Why, if your homeland still needed you, no one had come. In the rare moment of stillness, when the rain came down too hard to move, or the night stretched too cold to sleep, he must have thought about it. Not surrender, perhaps, but possibility. That word must have haunted him. The possibility that the world had changed and he hadn't. That everyone else had gone home, and he had simply missed the call. And it wasn't just the world outside that changed. It was the jungle itself. Over the years, he had seen it shift. Trees fell. Trails disappeared. Old hiding spots were swallowed by vines. Even the animals behaved differently. Seasons blurred together. Onoda didn't age so much as dissolve into the landscape. He lost track of time. Not in the forgetful way of the elderly, but in the isolating way of those who no longer need clocks. And then there were the ghosts, the men he had served with, each one gone. Some killed, some surrendered. Each disappearance a small tearing of the fabric he'd relied on. They weren't just comrades. They were anchors. Every time he buried one, he wasn't just losing a friend. He was losing a part of his own certainty. The last one to fall, in 1972, had been with him for over 15 years. They had eaten from the same pots, shared firelight, fought side by side. And in the aftermath of that final gunfight, Onoda had to bury him alone. No ceremony, no prayers, just soil and memory. And after that, there was only silence. He wrote later that it was the most difficult moment of his life, not because he feared death, but because without anyone left to witness it, his war became internal. Without someone beside him to reflect his conviction, it became harder to hold on to. Still, he didn't stop, because that was the paradox. The longer he stayed, the harder it became to leave. Not because he didn't want to, but because the weight of time made surrender feel like betrayal. If he gave up after 5 years, that might have been understandable. 10 years, loyalty. 15, devotion. But 25? 28? That wasn't a mission anymore. That was a life. To let it go now would mean admitting he'd wasted all of it. And so he doubled down. That is perhaps the most human part of the story. How many of us stay in the wrong place, the wrong job, the wrong belief? Not because we don't know better, but because the cost of changing course feels too high. Because admitting we were wrong after so long would unravel everything we built on that foundation. For Onoda, the jungle was not just survival. It was a shield against that unraveling. But still, the questions must have come. In the rustle of the trees, in the flicker of firelight reflecting in his own eyes. What if I left? What would be waiting for me? Would I be welcomed or pitted, admired or forgotten? And if I walked out now, who would I be? Because without the war, there was no mission. And without the mission, what was he? And yet the moment did come. The order was spoken, the command delivered. And when he finally stepped into the sunlight, rifle lowered, sword in hand, he looked not like a man broken, but a man released. Released not just from the jungle, but from the impossible weight of purpose carried too long. He never publicly admitted regret. But sometimes truth comes in silences, in pauses between sentences, in the way a man avoids certain topics, in the way he looks away when someone says, "You did the right thing," and he doesn't nod, because maybe deep down a part of him wished someone had come sooner. Maybe the war would have ended in his heart before it ended in the world. In the end, Hiroo Onoda lived not as a warrior, but as a reminder, a living testament to something both admirable and dangerous, the unshakable power of belief. His life didn't fit neatly into any moral category. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't failure. It was something more complex, something more honest. He outlived his war, outlasted the empire that has shaped him. And yet, even decades later, his story still resonates. Not because we all want to be like him, but because, in some quiet way, we already are. Onoda's war was fought in the jungle, but everyone at some point wages a quieter war in their own mind, against doubt, against change, against the terrifying idea that what we build our identity around might no longer be true. We cling to habits, to convictions, to stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what the world means. And we resist any evidence to the contrary, because letting go isn't weakness, it's painful, and in some ways, far more terrifying than holding on. Onoda never asked to be a symbol. He didn't choose legacy. He was, in his mind, simply doing what he was told, doing it perfectly, unflinchingly. He didn't surrender because no one told him to, and when they finally did, he obeyed with the same precision he had lived by. That's not madness. That's consistency. But what makes his story powerful isn't just what he did. It's what it reveals about us. It asks uncomfortable questions. How long should we hold on to what we believe? At what point does principle become prison? When does discipline become denial? And if everything we live for suddenly disappears, do we have the courage to live for something else? For some, Onoda is a tragic figure, a man betrayed by his country, left to rot in the name of honor. For others, he's a quiet kind of hero who gave everything for a duty no one remembered. But both views miss something essential. Hiroo Onoda was a human being, flawed, faithful, proud, and eventually free. When he passed away in 2014, there were no grand parades, no monuments unveiled, just a wave of quiet remembrance. People who'd heard his story paused for a moment, not to glorify, but to reflect, because something in it struck a nerve. Not the war, not the jungle, but the idea of carrying something inside you long after the world has moved on. That's the part that lingers. We all carry something, a past, a fear, a belief we've wrapped ourselves in so tightly we've forgotten what it feels like to move freely. And maybe that's a real jungle, not the vines or the heat, but the stories we tell ourselves to stay safe, and the silence we retreat into when the world no longer agrees. Onoda came home to a country he no longer recognized, but his presence forced Japan to look back, to remember what had been sacrificed, not just lives, but minds, ideals, innocence. He stood not just as a relic, but as a question, one that echoes louder the longer you sit with it. How do you end a war that only you remember? And the answer, as Onoda showed, is painfully simple. You don't wait for the world to convince you. You wait for someone you trust to say the words, to show up, to tell you it's okay to stop. And maybe in the deepest part of us, we're all just waiting for that voice, that permission, that hand reaching into the silence. Onoda got his, at last, and he walked out of the jungle with his head held high, not because he had won, but because after all that time, he could finally stop fighting. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing of all.